G'day guys! In today's video we're going to go through the Chaos Space Marine Index for 10th edition and we're going to review every single data sheet. We're going to be focusing on the unique abilities that these units have, the raw power in their data sheet, in their profiles, and we're going to be talking about some really interesting combos that you can achieve with Chaos Space Marines in 10th edition. So let's get stuck into the video.
Look for the Blood God.
Alright, first up, let's talk about Dark Pacts. Now, this is the army rule for the Chaos Space Marines. Basically, what this is every time a unit activates to shoot or fight, you can make a Dark Pact, and if you do so, that unit grants sustained hits or lethal hits, which is basically going to mean that a 6 to hit is either going to generate 2 hits if you go with sustained hits, or it's going to automatically wound if you go with lethal hits. And then after the unit has finished its activation, you then have to make a leadership test, and if you fail that test, you take D3 mortal wounds. So this is the ability that all units in the Chaos Space Marine data sheets get, and it's a very, very powerful ability. What this is going to mean is that every single time your units go to shoot, you can just go, cool, I'm going to get that additional damage, and then I'm going to go in and fight, and I'm going to get additional damage, and this sort of replaces the wontons from the previous edition, but it's way more powerful because you're going to be able to do it every time that you fight or shoot, as opposed to having to wait for a specific turn to arrive or something like that. Now, one of the things worth noting is that you do have to take that leadership test, and if you fail it, you are going to take mortal wounds. So there is a world where the Chaos Space Marine armies do a lot of damage to themselves as a result of these wontons, so there are certain situations where you may choose not to engage in these, but generally speaking, you're going to want to do this every single time you activate and just do massive amounts of damage to your opponent. I did a video recently talking about how to identify when to select sustained hits and when to select lethal hits. There's quite a bit of nuance to it, so make sure you go back and check out that video. But the basic premise of it is, if you're going to be wounding your opponent on a 2 or a 3, you want to go with sustained hits. If you're going to be wounding them on a 5 or a 6, you want to go with lethal hits. And if you're wounding them on a 4+, you can kind of go with either. The maths checks out that basically if you're wounding on a 4+ and you get an additional hit, well, that's the equivalent of, getting an additional wound or an automatic wound. So generally speaking, you want to go with that sort of premise, but I did deep dive this because there are a lot of situations where you may want to change that up. So for example, if you have devastating wounds, you don't want to go with lethal hits because then you don't get to make the wound roll, and therefore you can't roll a 6 to wound and do those devastating wounds. That's just one of many examples. So head back and check out that video for a deep dive on Dark Pacts and the specifics on how to know when to use lethal hits and when to use sustained hits. Alright, the next important part about the sustained hits, lethal hits ability that you get from your Dark Pact is the Detachment Rule that Chaos Space Marines get, which is the Marks of Chaos. And basically the way this works is it triggers your lethal or sustained hit on a 5+ instead of on a 6+, based on the keywords that you give the unit. This is also really important because it does trigger a number of stratagems that is locked to specific marks. So let's go through the different marks now, talk about what they do, then we'll go through all of the different stratagems, what they do, and which ones are linked to each mark, and then we'll talk about which units you might want to put in Mark of Slaanesh, which ones you might want to put in Mark of Nurgle, etc. Alright, so the first one is Mark of Khorne, which is in the fight phase. If this unit's weapons gain the lethal hits ability from a Dark Pact, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, an unmodified hit roll of 5+ scores a critical hit. Next, Mark of Zinc. In the shooting phase, if this unit's gained lethal hits ability as a result of the Dark Pact, each time it makes an attack, an unmodified roll of 5+ scores a critical hit. Then you've got Nurgle, which is spreading the sickness. In the shooting phase, if this unit's gained the sustained hits ability in this phase, as a result of a Dark Pact, then a 5+ scores a critical hit. And for Slaanesh, it's in the fight phase if this unit's weapons gain sustained hits as a result of a Dark Pact. Each time this unit makes an attack, an unmodified roll of 5+ scores a critical hit. And then Chaos Undivided. Each time a model in this unit makes an attack, reroll a hit roll of 1. Alright, so looking at that, basically the keywords, the marks of Chaos, are going to trigger that Dark Pact on a 5+ instead of a 6+. If you want to do it in melee and you want to get lethal hits, you want to go with Khorne. If you want to do it in melee and go with sustained hits, you want to go Slaanesh. If you want to do it in shooting with lethal hits, you want to go Zeech. And if you want to do it in shooting with sustained hits, you want to go Nurgle. There is also the option to remain unmarked, which is going to give you rerolls, which is also a really good way of increasing the damage output on units. But the main decision on which one of these marks you're going to give units, I believe, is the stratagems that it gives them access to. So let's have a look at those. Alright, our first stratagem is Infernal Rights. So in your opponent's shooting phase or fight phase, just after an enemy unit has selected its target, you can spend 2 command points. 1 Heretic Astartes unit from your army that was selected as a target as one or more of the attacking units. Until the end of the phase, each time an attack is made against the unit, worsen the armor penetration characteristic of that attack by 1. Alright, so this is pretty expensive at 2 command points, but it does give you that ability to have stronger armor saves. You can also combine this with the core stratagem to gain the benefits of cover. So if you have a unit out in the open, you can go, cool, I'm going to spend 3 command points to go, cool, +1 to my saves, and the benefit of cover, or worsen the AP of your incoming attack, and the benefits of cover, which is +1 to my saves, making these units really, really difficult to shift. This is really strong on things like Obliterators or Terminators or those 2-up saves, and you can basically get +2 to your saving throw, and that means that even AP2 attacks, you're likely to be saving them on a 2+. Alright, next we have Profane Zeal. So your shooting or fight phase is when you trigger this for 1 CP, and 1 Heretic Astartes from your army that has not been selected to shoot or fight this phase. Until the end of the phase, each time the unit makes an attack, you can reroll a hit roll of 1 and a wound roll of 1. And if your unit is Chaos Undivided, you can instead reroll the hit roll and reroll the wound roll for that attack. Alright, so this is one of the ones where I was saying it's a really, really powerful stratagem based on the marks that you give the unit. So if you remain undivided, you get full rerolls to hit and wound, which is a massive increase in damage output. And this is particularly interesting on things with devastating wounds. So we're talking Mauler Fiends, we're talking Possessed, not Mauler Fiends, Forge Fiends, and Possessed. And basically when you get those reroll wounds, you're able to get way more devastating wounds, which means you're going to be putting out way more damage than if you didn't have that ability. So this stratagem is really, really exciting. Even on marked units, being able to reroll 1s to hit and wound, you're going to often have situations where you're hitting on 2s and wounding on 2s anyway, so it sort of functions in a similar way to reroll everything. And either way, it's a really good stratagem for 1 CP to really pump up the damage output of those units. Alright, next we have Eternal Hate. So it's 1 CP in the fight phase just after an enemy unit has selected its targets. 1 Heretic Astartes unit from your army that was selected as a target of one or more of the attacking unit's attacks. Until the end of the phase, each time a model in your unit is destroyed, if that model has not fought this phase, roll a d6, adding 1 to the result if it is a Khorne unit. On a 4+, do not remove it from play. That destroyed model can fight after the attacking model's unit has made its attacks, and is then removed from play. Alright, so fighting on death on a 4+ is really, really good, and it's even better if you're Mark of Khorne because you're fighting on death on a 3+. Now this means that you can throw those aggressive units out, and if your opponent does charge you with multiple things and they're going to kill you, you can go, cool, the first one that you fight, I'm going to fight on death with, and then the next one, I'm going to use the counter-offensive stratagem to interrupt you, and you're actually going to be able to dominate the fight phase in their turn, and then obviously go over into your own turn, and then dominate it again. This also serves as really good insulation against enemy units that have fight first, because currently, if you charge them, and they have fight first, they actually get to activate before you, which makes charging those fight first units really, really tricky. However, if you have Mark of Khorne, you can go in and you can charge that unit, and then you can go, cool, I'm going to fight on death on a 3+, and I'm going to get the vast majority of my units going to fight, even if your opponent kills you before you activate, because you can fight on death. So really, really powerful stratagem. Alright, next we have Skin Shift. Your command phase, 1 Heretic Astartes unit from your army for 1 command point. 1 model from your unit regains up to 3 lost wounds. In addition, if your unit is a Zinc unit and it's below its starting strength, 1 destroyed model, excluding character models, is returned to your unit with its full wounds remaining. Alright, so being able to resurrect models is really, really powerful. So if you're not Mark of Zinc, you only get to regenerate wounds, but if you are Mark of Zinc, you not only get to regenerate the wounds, but you get to bring a model back. So imagine a unit of Zinc Obliterators, right? They're 80-point models, they're really expensive, and for 1 CP, you can go, cool, I'm going to heal one back and resurrect one and get an additional 80 points worth of models in your arm. That's really, really good. And there's also some really interesting things you can do here with charges. If you're stringing out a unit and they've killed a model from it, you can resurrect that model at the front, gaining additional movement. So this is a movement trick. It's a powerful way of increasing the durability of your units, and it's also a really good way of just keeping things alive. So it's a really cool strategy, and is a strong reason why you might want to consider putting Mark of Zinc on your bigger units. Next, we have Unnatural Swiftness. So for one command point in your movement phase, one Hereticus Astartes unit from your army, until the end of the turn, your unit is eligible to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which it fell back. In addition, if your unit is a Slaanesh unit, until the end of your turn, your unit is eligible to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which it advanced. So spending one command point to move, advance, shoot, charge, fall back, all of it on a Mark of Slaanesh unit makes them an amazingly powerful and flexible unit. So Mark of Slaanesh is really, really interesting. This is really interesting on big things like a Mauler Fiend that can fly up the table and then advance and charge. It's really interesting on things that have high shooting capacity because you can fall back, shoot something, charge something else, or you can, advance, shoot something, charge something else. It really does pump up the flexibility and diversity of those units' damage output and capacity to engage with your opponent. Alright, and last but absolutely not least, we have Dark Obscuration. One command point in your opponent's shooting phase just after an enemy unit has selected its targets. One Hereticus Astartes unit from your army that was selected as a target of one or more of the attacking unit's attacks. Until the end of the phase, your unit has the stealth ability. In addition, if your unit is a Nurgle unit, until the end of the phase, you can only be selected as a target of a ranged attack if the attacking model is within 12 inches. Absolutely S tier, and I think that this stratagem alone brings Chaos Space Marines into the A tier conversation about most powerful factions in the game, because it is truly broken what you can do with this stratagem. So far, almost every game of 10th edition that I've played with Chaos Space Marines, I've used this stratagem almost every turn, because you can take a big unit of something that's really, really scary and make it so that your opponent has to come within 12 inches in order to be able to target you, and if you do that, and they fail to kill you, you're going to be able to hit them in melee, which is where you want to be. Really, really powerful. So you could view this as in the shooting matchup, it's very powerful because your opponent has to come close to you in order to shoot you. So if you're trying to outrange them, you win the firefight from range. But you can also use this in combat matchups because you can take something like, say, a Mauler Fiend and you can go, cool, you can't shoot it from further away, so I'm going to move up into the middle and then I'm going to be able to charge you without being blasted in my deployment zone before I get an opportunity to bring those melee units to bear. You can also do some really interesting stuff with this, like putting a unit in the center of the table and using the Mark of Nurgle on it, which means your opponent has to come in close in order to be able to shoot it, which means you're then in your next turn able to spring counter charges. So you're able to use it as a Nurgle little bait unit that you put out on that central objective, and your opponent can't just sit back in their deployment zone and blow you off those objectives. They have to come out, and that allows you to spring traps on them. It means you're able to get line of sight and shoot them, or you're able to get in that charge range and do heavy damage in melee. This is a really, really powerful stratagem, has a lot of flexibility, only costs one command point, and it's linked to Mark of Nurgle, which I actually think even without this stratagem is probably one of the strongest marks, because sustained hits is one of the abilities that you're going to want to use more often than the lethal hits, in my opinion. And also, the Chaos Space Marines, in my opinion, are a little bit more of a shooting army than they are a melee army based on the current edition and the way that things are currently panning out. So you're going to be wanting to say sustained hit, and you're going to want to do it in shooting, which means you want Mark of Nurgle, and then you also have this stratagem that you want. So really, really powerful stratagem. There's some really interesting tricks that you can do with it. Alrighty, and the last part of the army rules before we get into the data sheets are the enhancements. Now, as with the stratagems, these are locked to specific marks of chaos, which actually does make these kind of difficult to build into your lists, because some of them you might want a mark of Khorne unit, but you want the Mark of Zinc stratagem on a enhancement on a character, but now they can't join. So you are a little bit limited with your access to these. However, there are some really, really interesting ones that are worth considering. Alright, so we've got the Talisman of Burning Blood. So this one's Khorne only, and you add 1 to the strength and attacks characteristic of the bearer's melee weapons, and each time the bearer makes a Dark Pact, until the end of the phase, add D3 to the attacks and strength characteristic of the bearer's weapons instead. And this one's only going to set you back 20 points. Alright, so looking at this, given that you're likely to be doing Dark Pacts anyway, it's really, really powerful being able to go, cool, plus D3 attacks and strength. One of the downsides is that the D3 strength isn't as relevant because you're likely to be Mark of Khorne, where you're going to be Mark of Khorne, which means you're getting lethal hits on a 5+ and therefore not needing to roll to wound, so the strength itself isn't necessarily that relevant, but you're not always going to be rolling those 5-ups, so it does mean that those other attacks are going to be likely to wound as well, and you are going to be getting additional attacks to make those wound rolls with. So it is very powerful, and it is very, very good, and I think that there's a strong argument to be made for like a Demon Prince with wings and this relic, or this enhancement, that is going to be a true beat stick and do serious damage. Alright, next up we have the Eye of Zinc. It's a Zinc model only, no surprises there. Each time the bearer's unit makes a Dark Pact, take a leadership test for the bearer. If the test is passed, you gain 1 command point. Alright, so for this one of the ways I've been playing with it is to take a Warpsmith, attach him to a unit of Legionaries, and then he hangs out with your Forge Fiends and your various Daka elements in your backfield. And because that Legionary unit has a las cannon, it can fire down range. Every time it does, you make a Dark Pact roll, and you're generating command points, which you can then use then and there on other powerful stratagems. So really, really cool little combo there. Meanwhile, that Tech Marine or that Warpsmith is healing your Forge Fiends up. He's, providing combat damage to anything that comes nearby. He's just an all-round really good unit, and being able to generate command points is really interesting. It is worth noting that you can only generate 1 command point per battle round, so if you are playing with tactical objectives and you're discarding cards at the end of the battle round and therefore generating command points from the discarding of a card, you will not also generate them from this relic. But I think even over the course of the game, if you only generate 1 or 2 command points from this, it's paid for itself. It's only 30 points, and I would pay 30 points for an extra command point in my list every single time. So I think it's really good, and I think if you've got a character that isn't necessarily being attached to a specific unit that is another mark, you can definitely make him Mark of Zinc, and you can definitely justify this enhancement. Next, we have the Orb of Unlife. So this is a Nurgle model only. At the end of the 5-phase, roll 1d6 for every enemy unit within 6 inches of the bearer, adding 1 to the result if the bearer's unit made a Dark Pact this phase. On a 3+, that enemy unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. Alright, so if you do have something fast like a Demon Prince or something like that, you give him this enhancement, you can throw him into the middle of your opponent's lines, and then you can use the Orb, and basically on a 3+, if you've done a Dark Pact, you're going to be doing D3 mortal wounds to every enemy unit within 6 inches. That's really, really powerful. That being said, I feel like this one's a little bit harder to pull off because you've got to get in a certain place with a certain character at a certain time. This can be kind of tricky to execute, so I'm not entirely sure if I rate this one. I haven't included it in any of my lists as yet, but it is interesting. So let me know in the comments below if you've had similar, ideas, or if you think this is more relevant than I've maybe made it out to be. Alright, next we have Intoxicating Elixir. So Slaanesh model only. The bearer has a Feel No Pain 5+ ability, and each time the bearer's unit shoots or fights, if the bearer made a Dark Pact this phase, then after the bearer has resolved those attacks, select 1 enemy unit that was hit by 1 or more of those attacks, and that enemy unit must take a Battle Shock test. Alright, so a 5-up Feel No Pain is very interesting. It does make things like a Demon Prince or a Disco Lord or, those big chunkier characters, it does make them significantly more difficult to deal with. And the ability to put people on Battle Shock tests, as we know, is really interesting because it can hamper their ability to use stratagems. It reduces them to OC 0, making it easier for you to take objectives from them. It is interesting. However, like with the Orbs of Unlife, I feel like this one's probably one of the less competitively viable enhancements. And I haven't been able to write any lists that have any interesting Slaaneshi characters in them yet. So I think that you're probably going to overlook this for the other ones, particularly the Zinc one. And then last, we have the Liber Hereticus. So this is an undivided model only. Each time the bearer's unit makes a Dark Pact, that unit's weapons gain lethal hits and sustained hits until the end of the phase, instead of just gaining 1 of those abilities. This one is the most expensive, coming in at 40 points. Alright, so being able to get sustained hits and lethal hits is really, really interesting, particularly on something like a big unit of Terminators that's going to be doing massive amounts of shooting damage and massive amounts of melee damage, and a lot of their stuff doesn't necessarily have devastating wounds. If you're taking the Combi Bolters, and you're taking like power fists and things like that, you don't really care if you're rolling those 6s to wound, you just want to wound. So being able to go cool and getting 6s to hit will give me an additional hit and an auto wound, makes the damage output on those units really, really crazy. That being said, 40 points is a lot of points to spend, and all of a sudden you start approaching Death Star territory, where you're like, cool, I've got a big expensive unit, I've put a big expensive character in it, and he has a big expensive enhancement. You're really investing a lot of points in that unit, so that unit really does need to do serious damage. Alrighty guys, there we have all of the army-wide rules for Chaos Space Marines in the Index from 10th edition Warhammer 40k. Some really interesting stuff there. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Let's get a conversation going. But now we're going to tip over into the data sheets. Now there's a lot of data sheets to cover here, and I'm going to try to get as many of them as I can done in this one video so that it's as best as possible of a full review as we can. However, there are a lot of similar data sheets in here that I might combine into one, and there's also a lot of data sheets that I may glance over. So bear with me, let's try and get through all of them if we can. Alright, first up we have Abaddon the Despoiler. Now, of all of the units that received changes from 9th edition into 10th edition, I think he's one of the most changed, and I think this goes across all factions. He really did flip on his head. In 9th edition, he was almost unkillable with a phase cap of 3. He had the ability to use Mark of Zinc to ignore wounds. He was able to be, hidden behind units where you couldn't even target him at all. He was really, really difficult to deal with. In this edition, he's way easier to kill. He's got less wounds, he doesn't have the phase cap. If you want to protect him, you have to attach him to a unit, and then your opponent can just nuke that unit and then kill Abaddon in the process. People can get challenges to execute him specifically out of units. There's tons of ways that you can deal with Abaddon, so he's nowhere near as powerful defensively as he used to be. That being said, he has a massive glow up in his abilities. Right, so now the way it works is in your command phase, you select one of the following 3 abilities, and then you get to apply that to Abaddon the Despoiler. The first one, and I think by far the most important one, is that he has a 6-inch aura of reroll all hits. Previously, he was able to select a unit and give them reroll hits, and if they were a Black Legion unit, it was reroll hits and wounds, but it was selecting a unit, which meant you were incentivized to have really big units, and then you could put Abaddon's buffs on them and get massive value. Whereas now, it's a 6-inch aura. And what that means is that you can run Abaddon down the center, and you can have all your units clustered around him, and all of them get reroll hits. This is way more powerful than it was beforehand. His other ability is a 6-inch aura again of a 4-up invulnerable save for infantry. Now this one's interesting as well. You can use this when you've got, like, say, a lot of cultists or a lot of legionaries or things like that, where you want to increase the durability of them. That being said, I think more often than not, you're going to go with the reroll hits. His third ability, which is the one that I think you'll never use, is the one that allows you to reroll battle shock tests. And to be honest, I think most of the time, you're probably just going to want to be killing your opponent or choosing to try to be durable and survive, in which case you want to go with one of his other 2 abilities. Relying on those battle shock tests, which you can always auto-pass with a command point or just roll them, they're not that hard to pass. You've got relatively high leadership across the board, or relatively strong leadership across the board, so I don't think you'll ever use this one, to be honest. I think Abaddon's main utility is going to be from providing those aura buffs. The other thing that Abaddon has, which is very, very interesting and very, very often overlooked, is he has all 4 of the marks, which means when you attach him to a unit, that unit has all 4 of the marks, which means it gains access to all of the stratagems, and it gets the reroll hits ability from Abaddon, and it gets sustained hits on a 5+, it gets lethal hits on a 5+, in both shooting and melee. This is crazy amounts of damage that any unit that you attach Abaddon to is going to do. He can be quite squishy, and there's nothing in the Chaos Space Marine Codex that is particularly durable, nothing like the old Terminator bricks that we used to use, but the damage output on these units is next level. Abaddon himself does a massive amount of damage, but so does any unit that you attach him to. So a lot of people are talking about running him with a big unit of 10 Terminators, so we're going to have a similar looking list to the way we used to in 9th. However, it's worth noting that it's nowhere near as durable. You need to be able to wield this unit aggressively. Alright, next up we have Hearken the World Claimer. Now this is the Chaos Lord that's got jump pack and he's like a raptor champion. He's really, really interesting. One of the things that he does is you attach him to a big unit of 10 raptors. And when they charge in, you get to roll 11 dice because you've got 10 raptors plus him. And for every 4+, your opponent suffers a mortal wound. So he's going to be able to charge things and do pretty heavy mortal wounds on the charge in. And then he goes in and does a decent amount of damage himself. So he's a really interesting pick. Hearken is, however, 120 points, which does make him one of the more expensive characters, and you're also attaching him to a unit of raptors, which aren't necessarily the most powerful unit in the game, and you're going to want to be taking a unit of 10 in order to get maximum utility from his abilities, which means you're now putting a lot of points into this bomb, and it's a bomb that dies very easily and is quite expensive. So I'm not 100% sold on Hearken as a competitive unit, but I could be wrong. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. Alright, next up we have Huron Blackheart. Now this guy is very, very interesting. He's only 80 points, which makes him an absolute bargain. He is a steal. You can attach him to a unit of Legionaries or Chosen, and he adds 1 to the objective control of the unit that he's attached to. Which means if you do attach him to Legionaries, he's giving them objective control 3, which is really, really good. It means that you're going to be able to steal objectives off people with very, very little effort required because you just put those OC3 bottles on there. You go, boop, 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 there's 3 on there, that's OC9, taking that objective off of a knight or whatever. Very, very strong. But the main reason that I think he's almost an auto-include for Chaos Space Marine lists is that he allows you to redeploy up to 3 infantry units. Now, redeploys are so powerful because what they allow you to do is deploy hyper aggressively, and then if your opponent goes first, you can then redeploy defensively. Or you can do it inverse. You can deploy defensively, and then if you win the roll and you get that first turn, you can redeploy aggressively and then go full send. So that ability to redeploy units is so powerful, and it's only on infantry units, but some of the Chaos Space Marine's best units are infantry, like Possessed, like Obliterators, there's Terminators. You can do some really cool stuff. So, for example, you could take a big unit of 10 Terminators, put Abaddon in it, deploy it defensively out of line of sight. So if your opponent goes first, they can't touch it. But if you go first, you can go, cool, I'm going to use Huron to redeploy that Terminator unit on the front line and then run in and do massive explosive damage with this Terminator unit without risking it at any stage. You can also use this for things like Raptors. You can go, cool, I'm going to deploy them defensively so that they can't die, turn 1. But, oh, cool, I got first turn, so I'm going to redeploy them over on this side, and then I'm going to go use their movement to get all the way up a flank. And now all of a sudden, you've got Raptors deep in enemy lines without ever having risked them. I think Huron is an absolute steal for this. Not to mention the fact that he actually goes in with pretty serious damage on his melee profile. He actually is a bit of a beat stick himself, so he provides so much. And the other ability that he has is any unit that he's attached to, if an enemy unit finishes a normal move, advance, or whatever within 9 inches of him, he can make a D6-inch move. Which means that if your opponent tries to get somewhere, you can either move out of their charge range with that D6 move, or you can move to try to block them if they were moving towards a different unit nearby, or you can use that move to end on an objective with more models than them using your objective control 3 in order to take that objective that they thought they were going to take. So many things that you can do with the Huron unit. Now, it's worth noting that if you do attach them to the Legionnaires or the Chosen, they're relatively squishy. Like, your opponent's going to be able to kill them in a single volley if they do shoot them down. So you need to play with this unit smart. You don't want to throw it away willy-nilly. But when you do have the ability to utilize it, it's going to be an absolute game changer of a unit. Let me know what you guys think of Huron in the comment section below. Do you think he's an auto-include, or do you think he's a bit meh and dies too easily? What do you think? Alright, next up we have the Damon Prince without wings. Now he's toughness 10 with a 2-up save, so he's way tougher than he previously was. However, he can be targeted if there's no enemy units. You know, he hasn't got lone operative, he's not, you know, the old character protection rule, and he can't join units. So he's just a solo operative. He's going to run in and he's going to have to do the damage and he's going to have to survive on his own merits. That being said, toughness 10 with a 2-up save is pretty freaking tough. So he's going to play very differently than the Demon Princes of old, but let's have a look at what he does on his abilities to see whether or not he's actually going to be providing the utility that you want in your list. So his ability is that he's got a 6-inch aura that's going to provide infantry units the benefit of cover, and he can reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll each time he shoots or fights. Now, the rerolls, that's just a really good way of just buffing up his damage a little bit. The benefits of cover is quite interesting. What that's basically going to do is that's going to mean that all of those units in your army that aren't able to get cover because they have to be on an objective somewhere or for various reasons, that's going to make them much, much tougher. That being said, in my experience of 10th edition, cover is very, very easy to get because all you have to do is have some of your unit obscured to some of their unit and you get the benefits of cover, which is really, really easy to achieve. So personally, I think that we're going to be facing a situation where cover is very, very easy to access, and therefore this Demon Prince isn't necessarily as big of a toolkit piece as he otherwise would be. It's also worth noting that he does gain additional benefits from Marks of Chaos. So you can make him a Mark of Khorne, and he's going to get +2 to the strength characteristic on his Hellforged weapons. Make him Zinc, he's going to get additional shots with his ranged weapon. You make him Nurgle, he's going to get additional toughness. Slanesh is going to get additional movement. So these are all really interesting. And then if you stack enhancements on top of that, you can actually make this guy into a pretty serious weapon on the tabletop. But again, I don't necessarily think he's worth considering in a competitive list. Alrighty, now let's talk about the Demon Prince with wings. He functions very similar to his brother that has no wings, but he gains fly, he gains additional movement, but he sacrifices a little bit of his toughness. Now, where these two units differentiate is where their abilities come into play. Now, the Demon Prince with wings basically gets to make these devastating charges, where you roll 1d6 for every wound that your Demon Prince has remaining, and for every 4+, you're going to be doing mortal wounds to the target. This means if your Demon Prince hasn't suffered any wounds yet, he's going to charge in, you're going to roll 10d6, and for every 4+, that's a mortal wound to the target, to a maximum of 6, and for an average of about 5. That's pretty good. Being able to just charge into something and do 5 mortal wounds, it kind of means that he gets a bit of a pseudo-tank shock, if you will, and it allows him to really just dig out those hard-to-target units and hard-to-kill units with high invulnerable saves and those sorts of things. So this guy's interesting. He's faster, he hits harder, and all of that, but he isn't quite as tough as the other Demon Prince. So you've got to take it or leave it with this and make your own decisions on which one you want to include in your competitive lists. So let me know in the comment section below, which Demon Prince do you think is more competitively viable in a Chaos Space Marines list? Do you like the one with the no wings but gives the aura of cover and has the various tools that he has? Or do you prefer the more solo style Demon Prince that flies around, he's a little bit more vulnerable and he doesn't provide the auras, but he does a little bit more damage and is easier to get into the damage dealing situations that you might want to create? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Alright, next up we have Fabius Bile. Now, he can only be attached to Chosen and Legionaries, so I think you're going to be going with Chosen in this case. And one of the things that he provides that unit is +1 strength and +1 toughness. Now, that's going to make these guys pretty hard to crack because they're going to be, if you've got Chosen, they're going to be toughness 6 with 3 wounds. That's pretty tough. That's like a possessed, but they have the ability to advance and charge. They have additional strength on those accursed weapons and power fists. They're going to be doing a lot of damage. Also, he does have the ability to reduce 1 incoming attack per turn to 0 damage, which means it's going to be harder for your opponent to deal with you. And the first time that he dies, you roll a d6, and on a 2+, he comes back to life. He will be on his own, but he'll still be alive. And that means that you can put him on an objective somewhere. If your opponent does go all in and wipe the unit, you're like, okay, cool. At the end of that phase, roll a d6 on a 2+, boop, he gets back up, and now he's free to go do things in your turn. So he's an interesting little unit. Being able to buff +1 strength and +1 toughness to your units is really interesting. That being said, I don't know if you really need those sorts of buffs on the Chosen or the Legionaries. I think you're better off with other characters that are going to buff these units in other ways. Also worth noting that Fabius Bile is 100 points and his best melee attacks are only AP 1, which means he's actually not really contributing a massive amount to the fight. He's not going to be killing a lot of things, and a lot of the characters that you can attach to units have serious melee damage, so they actually buff the unit's offensive capacity through their own attacks, whereas Fabius Bile buffs your offensive capacity through the buffs that he puts on the unit that he's with. So you've got to sort of conceptually look at him more as an upgrade to the unit as opposed to a character that attaches to the unit. That's the best way to look at him, and when you look at him through that lens, he's actually pretty interesting for 100 points. All right, now next up, let's have a look at Cipher. Now, Cipher is a really, really interesting one. Probably every second or third list that I've wrote, I've put Cipher in there because I keep circling back onto him because I do think he's quite interesting, mainly for his ability to increase the cost of a single stratagem in your opponent's army by 1 CP. This, I feel like it's a very, very useful ability to have. If you're versing somebody who has a stratagem that you know they're likely to want to use multiple times, like a Chaos Space Marine army that wants to use Mark of Nurgle over and over again, or the Dark Obscuration ability that is linked to Mark of Nurgle, or you're versing, say, Adeptus Custodes and they want to use the neg 1 damage over and over, or you've got a Chaos Knights army and they want to use the ability to walk through walls over and over. You know, being able to go, cool, I'm actually going to use this ability to make it so that that costs you twice as many command points if it goes from 1 command point to 2. That's really, really good. And I think it has the capacity to completely swing those games where your opponent thinks they're going to be able to just constantly put that neg 1 damage on, but they're actually not going to be able to put that on there as often as they would like. And if they are trying to do that, they're not going to be doing other stratagems. So bringing Cipher is a really interesting way of just being a massive pain in the ass for your opponent. Cipher is also a lone operative, which means you can leave him on an objective in your backfield and your opponent just can't shoot him. Doesn't matter if they got barrage, doesn't matter if they got anything, they can't target him. They have to get within 12 inches of him, which generally means they're going to have to break through your battle line. You're going to have Terminators, Possessed, Chosen, Obliterators, all of these things pushing up the table. And in order for your opponent to get to Cipher on your backfield objective, they're going to have to push through all of that, which is going to be quite difficult for them to achieve. So Cipher's he's tough in that regard, and he provides pretty good utility for your army. And he also has some shooting attacks that are interesting as well, being able to shoot at things that shot at one of his nearby units, so he gets to shoot back on their behalf. That's really interesting as well. So I think Cipher's a really interesting unit. I've taken him in a few lists and he's performed quite well for me, but he's relatively expensive as well. So trying to decide whether or not you want him or whether or not you want to take another unit that's going to contribute to the firefight or that's going to contribute to the fight in the middle of the table, as opposed to just sit on a backfield objective, a role that could be as easily filled by cultists, is a tricky one. It's a tricky balance to strike. All right, next up we have the Master of Possessions. Now this guy's really interesting. He adds 1 to the advance and charge rolls of units that he's attached to. He gives the units he's attached to a 6-up Feel No Pain, and you can attach him to a Legionaries unit, a Chosen unit, or, my favorite option, a Possessed unit. Now, Possessed are one of the stronger units in the Codex, in my opinion, and we'll get onto those in a moment, but adding a Master of Possessions to them is really, really interesting. So it's worth noting that when you attach this guy to a unit of Possessed, not only does he give them the +1 advance charge and the Feel No Pain, but they give him their ability, which is that every time their unit makes a Dark Pact, units with models within that unit gain the devastating wounds. And Master of Possessions has Anti-Psyker 2+. And what that means is that every time you target a Psyker, on a roll of a 2+ to wound, you're going to be dealing mortal wounds to them. And he has some high damage characteristics with both shooting and melee attacks. So this guy becomes an anti-Psyker fucking maniac when he's attached to a Possessed unit. So I do highly recommend him. I rate him highly. The question then becomes, do you want to take 10 Possessed and add him in and go for a bit of a Death Star, big damage dealing unit? Or do you want to be a cheeky little 5-man unit with him and go around and not rely so much on it to do heavy lifting, but be able to use it to punch above its weight? He's also relatively inexpensive as well, so I think he's a good attachment to an army, and he's really good in a unit of Possessed. Alright guys, now let's have a look at the Chaos Lord. He has an ability that I think is really, really interesting in that you can use a stratagem for 0 command points, and it can be a stratagem that you've already used this phase. Now that means that you can have 2 units and you can put Mark of Nurgle on both of them, making 2 units untargetable. That's really interesting because it means that you can put 2 units out in the open, shoot with both of them, and then in your opponent's turn, when they go to shoot one of them, you go, cool, Mark of Nurgle 1 CP, and then they go, oh god, okay, I'll shoot that unit, and you go, cool, Mark of Nurgle for 0 CP, and now they can't shoot you. Or I should say Dark Obscuration, not Mark of Nurgle. Mark of Nurgle is the thing that you take that unlocks Dark Obscuration, and then you can use that on both of these units, making a decent portion of your army untargetable. And that's really, really powerful. It is obviously linked to the units that he attaches to, but you can attach him to some pretty interesting stuff. So I think it's really interesting the way that this guy works, and he's definitely something you're going to want to consider when writing your lists. Alright, next up we have the Chaos Sorcerer. Now, unfortunately in 10th edition you don't have a range of psychic powers to select from, you just get stuck with the ones that are on his datasheet, and unfortunately for this lad, they're not particularly interesting. The unit that he's attached to, when your opponent goes to shoot you, your opponent must subtract 1 from their hit rolls, making any unit he's attached to slightly harder to hit, and therefore harder to kill. But he doesn't really add any damage output to those units, doesn't really add any interesting utility in the forms of free stratagems or additional movement or anything like that. And his damage output himself isn't anything that's like, oh my god, I need to include a sorcerer so that I can shoot mind bullets at people. It's just kind of meh, in my opinion. I'm not a huge fan of the sorcerer, unfortunately. Alright, next up we have the Terminator Sorcerer. Now this guy's interesting. You attach him to a unit of Terminators, he gives them re-rolls to their advance and charge rolls, and also he can select an enemy unit and roll a d6. On a 2+, he makes it so that all attacks that target that enemy unit gain an additional pip of AP, which means he's going to be able to select an enemy unit, and then you're going to be going, cool, all my bolters are now AP1, all my obliterators are doing additional AP, my Forge Fiends are doing additional AP, everything that targets that unit is going to be doing way more damage. It's kind of like the Oath of Moment of the Loyalists, but it's tied to a character in your army that goes in and targets an enemy unit. This is really interesting, and I think in this edition, AP in general has gone down, meaning that being able to do this to bring it back up to a world where we're dealing a lot of damage is very interesting, and a lot of people are relying on the fact that AP has gone down, and they're bringing things with 2-up saves. But if you're able to bring that AP back, it's very interesting. Alright, next up we have Lucius the Eternal. Now this is really interesting. He adds fight firsts to any unit that he's attached to, which is really, really powerful because it means that even if your opponent charges you, you get to strike first. So that's really interesting. He also has an ability, Armor of Shrieking Souls, which is basically when he's destroyed, he deals mortal wounds to the unit that destroyed him, and if those mortal wounds kill the unit, he is then brought back from the dead. So that can make him really tricky to deal with, and because they're going to be fighting first, then if you do manage to fight and kill him, he's going to come back. Real painful. But one of the main things that he does is he unlocks Noise Marines as a battle line unit. And the Noise Marines are very aggressively costed. They're very competitively viable. And being able to bring 6 units of them is a real big flex. And then attaching one of them with him so that that one fights first and is doing all this crazy stuff is quite interesting. So I really do like Lucius the Eternal. I think the Noise Marine players and the Emperor's Children players out there should be pretty happy with this, and he's a very flavorful choice for them, and it gives them the ability to run a list that is unique and has that Emperor's Children vibe that they love. Alright, now let's take a look at the Lord Discordant. Now he's quite interesting because we're currently entering a meta where vehicles are very, very popular, and he has a few unique abilities that impact vehicle targets. So one of them is that in your opponent's shooting phase, he can target a vehicle unit within 12 inches of him. They take a leadership test, and if they pass, they have -1 to hit. If they fail, they are ineligible to shoot. So that means he can completely shut off the shooting damage of those units. This is really interesting because it's a unit within 12. So if you take him with Mark of Nurgle, you move him up into the center, your opponent has to end within 12 because they know that if they're outside of 12, you can just pop the strat and they can't shoot you. Which means he's going to have to end within 12, and then you can use this ability to stop them from shooting you. Which means that the Mark of Nurgle Lord Discordant can be a real difficult unit to put down in certain situations. Further to that, in your shooting phase, you can select an enemy vehicle, and then you get the ability to reroll wounds against that target, which is going to greatly increase the damage output of your units. So rerolling wound rolls of 1 against an enemy vehicle when you're getting, sustained hits, or you're getting, high damage attacks getting through every time you do wound, it's going to be really, really interesting. Alright, next up we have the Warp Smith. Now he's really interesting. He gains Lone Operative whilst within 3 inches of a friendly vehicle, so he can't be just targeted and killed, and he doesn't require a unit in order for him to be protected. And he can pick one vehicle, heal it, and give it +1 to hit, which means he's massively improving the damage capacity and survivability of those vehicles in your lists. I've been running him around with a Forge Fiend, and it's been amazingly powerful. The damage output that that Forge Fiend can do when it's hitting on 2s, and the survivability of it when it's doing those hazardous checks and it's losing mortal wounds to Dark Pacts, but then he's just topping it back up from behind and healing it. Really, really interesting. So I like this guy. I think he's relatively cheap. He's points efficient. He fills that HQ slot if you don't have anybody else in that position, and he provides utility to your stronger units like your Forge Fiends by buffing up their damage output. I think the Warpsmith is an absolute steal, and I think is something that we should all be considering when writing our Chaos Space Marine lists. Alright, next up we have the Exalted Champion. Now, he can be attached to Chosen and Legionaries, and interestingly, he can be attached to a unit that already has another character in it, and what he provides is +1 to the hit rolls for the unit that he's attached to. So this means that if you're putting him in a big unit of Chosen, and you're putting in somebody like, say, Fabius Bile, now they're getting +1 strength, +1 toughness, +1 to hit. They've got 2 characters in the unit, and they both give each other's buff to each other. So this guy's getting the +1 toughness and strength from Fabius, and Fabius is getting the +1 to hit from this guy. You can actually create some really interesting units with some moving pieces that are all providing auras and buffs to each other, and go in and do serious damage. That being said, most of the units that you're going to have characters in them are going to be hitting on 2s already anyway, so getting +1 to hit from this guy is not particularly relevant, and a lot of the units that you're going in with are going to be either Abaddon's included, and therefore they're getting reroll hits, +1 hit on the unit isn't really that relevant, or, you know, there's various things where it's not that relevant. So it depends on your list, depends on what you're going for, but I'm yet to find a way to write this guy into a competitive list where he's necessary and pushes a unit to a world of damage output that they can't arrive at through other means. Alright, next up we have the Dark Apostle. Now basically he attaches to a unit and he's going to give them +1 to their wound rolls, which is way more impressive than the +1 to their hit rolls from the Exalted Champion. This is going to take your units and make it so that they can actually do serious damage to those big tough targets. He also can, once per battle, at the end of any phase, take a friendly unit and make them no longer battle shocked. This is really interesting because it allows you to score those primary points if your opponent battle shocks you, or if you're about to go in and do something and your opponent battle shocks you, but you would plan to use a stratagem, you can go, cool, I'm going to take this ability, make that unit no longer battle shocked so that I can now use that stratagem or that ability. There's some really interesting stuff that you can do with this guy. I think he's quite good, but he's relatively expensive, and his units that he's able to be attached to are things like Accursed Cultists and Cultists, which in all fairness don't really care about being +1 to wound. You know, their damage output is negligible anyway. So I don't know if I like him, and I'm yet to write a list with him in it, but I think there's a world where maybe he can be used. So let me know in the comments below if you've used the Dark Apostle in any of your units or any of your lists. Alright, next up we have the Dark Commune. Now this guy gets attached to either Cultists or Accursed Cultists. He gives you the ability to advance and charge, and he also, once per game, can give you the ability to get +1 to your hit and wound rolls. So this actually makes these units really, really powerful. And simultaneously, he gives a 5+ invulnerable save to the unit he's attached to, which on things like Cultists or Accursed Cultists actually makes them quite annoying to remove from the table. I actually kind of like this. I think it's a little bit too expensive. Like when you take this guy and a big unit of Accursed Cultists, it's like, yeah, once per game, it's going to do serious damage, but it's actually quite expensive. And I think you're probably better off with more traditional Chaos Space Marine units over these sort of cultisty themed units. But I think there's definitely a place for it. And the Accursed Cultists are quite interesting in their own right. So I definitely think this is kind of cool. Personally, I don't like the models, and often when I'm looking at a unit, I struggle to get past the whole, I don't like the models, so therefore I don't even really give it the time of day, which is probably a weakness on my end, but let me know if you've had results with them. Let me know if you think they're good. I look at the data sheets, and even when I do get past the hideous models, I'm not really impressed by the mixed, messy kind of nature of the unit. Having multiple different models in the unit with different weapons and different profiles, and then you've got the torments and you've got the, you know, the mutants and you've got all this stuff. It's just like, I don't know. For me, I prefer cleaner, just things where it's like, boom, this is Terminators, they do damage, done. So Let me know what you guys think. Maybe I'm completely wrong here, but I personally don't rate the Accursed Cultists, and as a result, I don't necessarily rate the Dark Commune. Alrighty, now let's get into some of the units that are available. We've talked about all of the different characters so far. Let's talk about some of the units that you can put in. And the first, straight out the gate, is Legionaries. Now, their ability is that they get reroll 1s to wound on melee weapons, and they get full reroll to wound on their melee weapons if the target of the attack is on an objective marker. Now, this is really interesting because obviously, in order for your opponent to be scoring those primary points and a lot of the secondary objectives, they're going to want to be on those objective markers. So that is going to often result in you getting full reroll to wound with this unit, which is going to be really interesting. If you pair that with Abaddon, you're going to be getting full rerolls to hit and wound against every time you charge something that's on an objective, which makes these Legionaries really, really scary in melee. They also get a few different weapon upgrades in there. You can get Accursed weapons or a Power Fist on the champion. You can get a heavy melee weapon like Big Chain Axe on a guy. So you can actually kit these guys out pretty heavily for combat with chain swords on the rest, and they do pretty good damage. So I actually do rate the Legionaries. They're a little expensive in my opinion at 20 points a model or 200 points for a unit of 10 of them. But I think there's definitely a world where you have Abaddon and a ton of Legionaries, and you just flood the board with things that are re-rolling all hits and wounds all the time, and getting sustained hits or lethal hits on those rolls is really, really crazy in combat. Especially if you then go, cool, I'm going to make them all Mark of Khorne. So now, if my opponent charges me, I'm fighting on death on a 3+ with these guys and re-rolling all my hits and wounds because I'm on the objective marker and so are they. Really kind of interesting. So let me know what you guys think of the Legionaries. There's tons of different ways you can run them. You could run them as Mark of Nurgle so that you can use the Dark Obscuration stratagem to make it so that they can't be targeted and they can sit on a backfield objective somewhere, really hard to move, and then they can provide long-range firepower with las cannons and things like that, getting those sustained hits on a 5+ because of Mark of Nurgle. That's kind of interesting. You can make a Mark of Slaanesh, and now all of a sudden they can advance, charge, shoot, fall back, all of that really cool tech stuff, and it sort of turns your Legionaries almost into Chosen in the way that they operate on the tabletop. There's a few different really cool tricks you can do here, but the other thing worth noting with these guys is they're one of the primary units that your characters attach to. And because these guys have the ability to reroll wounds against targets that are on objectives, that translates over to your characters as well. So if you've got a character that has something like Devastating Wounds and you want to be able to get reroll wounds on that character, that's something that you can do here with the Legionaries. And also, if you add Abaddon to the Legionaries, they gain all of the keywords, which means they're getting exploding 5s in shooting and in melee with both lethal and sustained hits. So really, really interesting stuff there on the Legionaries. All right, next we have Cultists, and I think this is the unit that every single Chaos Space Marine army should have at least one of, and that's primarily because they are a cheap unit, they screen out your backfield, they create auras where your opponent can't arrive from deep strike or anything like that, and most importantly, they have sticky objectives. So basically their unique ability is that in the command phase, if you hold an objective, that objective remains under your control until your opponent takes it from you. And what this means is that you can deploy on an objective. In your first command phase, you stick that objective, so now that objective remains under your control until your opponent takes it from you. And now your cultists can move back, and they can sort of screen out your backfield, and they don't have to toe in on that objective anymore. You still hold it, even though you're not on it, which means that those cultists are free to move somewhere. Perhaps there's somewhere where an objective is out in the open, so you go, cool, I'm going to start on there, and then first turn, I'm going to stick it, and then I'm going to move somewhere where I can't be shot. And now your opponent, in order to take that objective from you, they need to come all the way over and take it. They can't just shoot you off of it and have you no longer hold it. Doesn't matter. You hold it regardless. So I think Cultists are an absolute steal, and I think they're an auto-include in most Chaos Space Marine lists. Alright, next up we have the Accursed Cultists. Now, these guys don't have the sticky objectives of traditional Cultists, however they are significantly tougher, and they do serious damage as well. When you take the mutants in the list and the torments, and then you can regenerate a torment or 3 mutants, that's really, really interesting. And it also means that you can do interesting stuff like put the unit out of line of sight, put a couple models in line of sight onto an objective, and then when your opponent shoots you, you remove those models, And then in your command phase, you go, cool, I'm going to regenerate my 3 mutants, and I'm going to put them back out, and now I'm on the objective again. So there's a few tricky things you can do there, and I think in the hands of a really experienced player, you're going to get a lot of value out of the Accursed Cultists. But like I said when talking about the Dark Commune, I hate these models. I think they're hideous, and I personally couldn't bring myself to include them in a list, even if they were a top-tier competitive unit. I just think they're so gross and yuck. It's like, no, I want power-armored, big, strong, scary motherfuckers, not these weird things that look like they're about to just die because they're mutating to the point where they don't function. All right, now we talk about Chaos Terminators. Now, these guys got a bit of a glow up in the way that they're toughness 5 now, they have a 4-up invulnerable save inbuilt, and their unique ability is that when they make a Dark Pact, they gain reroll to their hit rolls, which means you don't necessarily have to have Abaddon in the list, you don't have to include him in order to get those rerolls, and you don't have to use any stratagems on them in order to get those rerolls. They're a relatively self-sufficient unit, and I think a few units of 5 can be quite interesting in the way that they're kind of expensive, but they're durable, they do damage, they're flexible, there's a lot of stuff you can do with them. I do, however, think that the main play that people are going to be doing is a big unit of 10 with Abaddon attached, because when you give this unit of Terminators all 4 marks of Chaos, the amount of different things that you can do with that unit become exponentially interesting. So in the hands of an experienced player, all 4 marks of Chaos on a Terminator unit with Abaddon in there as a heavy damage dealer, there's not much that this unit can't solve. It's a very, very strong problem solver of a unit. All right, next up we have the Master of Executions. Now basically this guy is going to mean that any unit that he's attached to is going to get reroll hits against an enemy unit that has taken casualties, and if that enemy unit is below half starting strength, they're going to get reroll wounds as well. So he attaches to a unit and actually takes their damage up to next level. That being said, you're mainly going to be looking at attaching him to things like Legionaries who already get access to reroll wounds, and you have to have hurt the unit that you're charging in order to gain the reroll hits. So I'm not 100% sure if I rate him as a pick. That being said, he gets reroll wounds from the Legionaries, and he has devastating wounds, which means you don't have to use a stratagem in order for him to go in and do pretty serious damage. So he's an interesting pick. I don't know whether he's better than just having another unit though, and being able to have one unit with a character in it means that if your opponent targets that unit and kills it, they're going to kill your character as well. Whereas if you instead use his points to have a second unit of something, then your opponent has 2 different threats they have to deal with, instead of being able to deal with your threats and your character at the same time. So he's interesting, he's definitely interesting, and I think having him be able to maybe attach to a unit that's nowhere near Abaddon and it goes off and it's nowhere near objectives, it's going into your opponent's backfield somewhere and killing some Dakka, and being able to go, cool, they're still getting reroll hits and wounds because I've shot at that thing a little bit, weakened it, and then he goes in and closes the deal and finishes it off. That makes him kind of interesting. But generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of mechanics where you have to have already hurt something in order to trigger them, because chances are, if you're already hurting something, you've probably got the tools to deal with it from range, in which case you don't want to also be sending this guy in and having to deal with it in melee. You want to be able to just go, cool, this stuff deals with that in shooting, and this guy deals with that in melee. Whereas having to go, well, hang on, I actually have to shoot that thing, then charge it with this separate unit, it's a little bit too networked in that you require multiple different units working in concert to do the damage that you want. And I think that's just unnecessarily difficult to pull off. It is worth noting that you can add a Master of Executions to a unit that already has another character attached. So in the same way that we talked about the Exalted Champion being able to buff a unit that has a character and therefore provide those buffs to the character, you can do the similar thing here with the Master of Executions. And it's also worth noting that every time he does kill an enemy character, he's going to get a 1 command point generated for you for your troubles. So interesting stuff. He is 80 points, however, I'm not 100% sure if I think he's a valuable pick. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Have you run the Master of Execution, and has he provided the value for you that you would like? Or do you often find yourself wishing that you had spent those 80 points on another unit that was going to provide damage autonomously without requiring that character's support? Let me know what you guys think. All right, let's talk about Possessed. I find these guys to be very, very powerful. So their unique ability is that when they make a Dark Pact, they gain the Devastating Wounds keyword. And what that means is that every time they roll a 6 to wound, they're going to be doing 2 mortal wounds because they have 2 damage melee weapons. So these guys go in and do huge amounts of damage, particularly if you leave them unmarked and you use the stratagem to get reroll all hits and wounds. And then what you do is you basically go sustained hits, so you get a massive number of hits, giving you a massive pool of dice to roll for your wounds, and then you can reroll everything that's not a 6, so that you get maximum ability to deal those devastating wounds. Very, very strong. And then you can also add the Master of Possessions to this unit, and then he gains the devastating wounds from their ability, which means that his anti-psycho weapons are absolutely terrifying for psychic opponents. I think these guys are standouts as one of the strongest things from the book. They also have a 9-inch move and the ability to come on from strategic reserves. So what you can do is you can rapid ingress them. And this is really, really powerful because you basically deploy 9 inches away from your opponent with your rapid ingress. Then if they don't kill you in your turn, you get to move 9 inches. So you're going to be pretty much in base-to-base contact with them, making that charge unfailable. And it also means that if your opponent tries to screen you out, you can probably move up and then charge the units behind that screen if you can get around it. Whereas a unit with a 6-inch move may struggle to do that. Alright, next up we have the Chosen. Now these guys are very aggressively costed. They're only 23 points, so 3 points more than a Legionary, and they get an additional wound, they get an Accursed weapon, they also get the ability to advance and charge in a turn in which they fell back, which means these guys have massive utility on the table, and if they were battle line, you'd be seriously considering taking units of, like 6 units of these guys. They're really, really good. Alright, let's talk about Noise Marines. When I first read these guys' datasheet, I wasn't particularly impressed. Their unique ability is that enemy units that were targeted by them in the shooting phase have to take a battle shock test, which is interesting in the way that if you shoot a unit, they fail that battle shock test, they're not going to be able to use defensive stratagems like Overwatch or anything like that. So when you go to charge them, you're going to be able doing things. They're not going to be able to counter offensive. They're going to have 0 OC. So these are all really good, but it's relatively hard to force your opponent to fail that battle shock test. So not really that interesting. And their weapons aren't particularly interesting either. The Sonic Blast has got it's got a lot of shots, strength 5, but it's AP 0. So your opponent's going to be getting good saves and you're not going to be doing a massive amount of damage. I was like, relatively unimpressed. But then I saw the points cost, and these guys are only 85 points for a unit of 5. So all of these times when I've been saying, I don't know whether you want to take this character because you could bring another unit, that other unit could be a unit of Noise Marines. Most characters are around 85 points, and the Noise Marines are 85 points. And when you look at them side by side, you're like, cool, add a character to this unit and he does some stuff, but if that unit gets wiped out, he's gone too. Whereas if you go, cool, I'm going to take that unit, and instead of the character, I'm going to take a new unit of Noise Marines as well. Now you have multiple different things. The Noise Marines can do damage from downrange with their Blastmaster. They can hold objectives. They can, screen out your opponent. They can do actions and secondaries. They just provide so much utility and function to a list that a character doesn't. So you've got to strike that balance yourself and decide how much you want to go down the add characters to units route, or how much you want to go down the multiple units route and have like lots of different things happening as opposed to big chunky bricks. That's an entirely up to you decision. It's going to depend on your playstyle. But the Noise Marines really do highlight just how cheap some units are and how you can use them to deal damage downrange and, all the different things that Noise Marines do. I think if you bring Lucius the Eternal, you will seriously consider bringing 6 units of 5 Noise Marines. I think you want to min-max these guys simply because you only get 1 Blastmaster per unit, regardless of whether you have 5 or 10 models in the unit. So you're going to want to bring 6 units of 5. A lot of the lists I've been writing have just had like 1 or 2 units in it, just as a cheap unit that can, sit on that backfield objective, contribute to the firefight, whilst being relatively difficult to kill if it's out of line of sight, those sorts of things. I really like them. I think Noise Marines are interesting. Alright, now let's talk about the Venom Crawler. Now, he's 140 points, he's got a 12-inch move, he's relatively tough, he's got relatively okay melee and shooting output, and he has a unique ability that means every time he basically kills a unit, if it's in melee, he gets +1 to his melee attack profile, and if it's in shooting, he gets +1 to his shooting attack profile, which is kind of interesting. That being said, I don't know whether this guy's worth it for 140 points. I feel like he's going to get isolated. He's a vehicle, so there's a lot of people that are teching for anti-vehicles these days because vehicles are so common, And of the vehicles you have access to for his points cost, I don't think he's a standout. I think you're going to be looking down the route of things like Predators if you want the range support, Forge Fiends if you want the range support, Mauler Fiends if you want the melee, and I think that this guy, he's a little bit of he does everything okay, but nothing particularly well. And the fact that his unique ability is something unique to him, it doesn't buff nearby units, it's just his own little thing that he does. And in order for him to get any benefit out of it, he has to have already killed things, means that he's not going to get that massive damage on the earlier stages of the game. So you have to buff him up. Alrighty, let's talk about Chaos Bikers. Now, they've had some pretty interesting changes. They've gone from a 14-inch move with a 6-inch auto advance for a total of 20 inches worth of potential movement to a 12-inch move and requiring a D6 on that advance. So they're much, much slower now than they have been before. They didn't gain really anything in terms of toughness or damage output, but what they did gain is a new unique ability that's basically allows you to pick them up and then redeploy them if they are within 6 inches of a battlefield edge. So you can picture it like they come off here and then they come back on over here, and that actually turns out to be a massive ability of movement. There's also a lot of the missions in this edition where you can strat reserves walk onto objectives. So if you have these guys near your backfield and then you draw a card saying that you require that objective over there, you can just pull these guys off and then bring them back on. It is worth noting that when you pull them off, that's at the end of your opponent's turn. So your opponent is going to have an opportunity to shoot and kill that unit, and if it survives and is within 6 inches of a table edge, you can then pull it off and put it back into strategic reserves. So it's not necessarily a guaranteed thing. And I think given that the damage output of these guys didn't really go up, the durability didn't really go up, and the movement is linked to an ability that triggers at the end of your opponent's turn, I don't necessarily think that the Chaos Bikers are going to be a particularly competitively viable choice. Alright, let's take a look at Raptors now. These guys are interesting. They have a aura of -1 to the leadership and battle shock tests, which is quite interesting. And also, in the fight phase, they force your opponent to take those battle shock tests. Now, of all times to force your opponent to take a battle shock test, the fight phase is one of the least interesting times because it's already after they've done their Overwatch and used any stratagems that they want to use, and at the start of their turn, they're going to return to normal status and they're going to have to take a battle shock test again in that phase. So it doesn't really matter if they get battle shocked in the fight phase. There's some niche scenarios where it matters, like, you know, if you need to control an objective at the end of your turn, for example, you can charge on, they fail the battle shock, they go to OC0, which means you control the objective, and then it ticks over to their turn and they go back to OC1. You know, there's some interesting stuff there, but I don't find this particularly, you know, powerful as an ability. What I do find interesting on the Raptors, though, is that they are dirt cheap. They are 95 points, you get multiple melee weapons, multiple special weapons in the unit, and that means that this is a fast little unit that can run around, it can score objectives when it needs to, or it can go in and it can blap things with melter guns. Like I was saying earlier, sometimes when you're looking at a character, you need to weigh up whether or not adding this character to that Legionary unit is better than just having an additional unit of Raptors that can deep strike in, get behind enemy lines, it can go deploy your teleport homers, it can, you know, investigate signals, it can, you know, charge things onto objectives and take the objectives. Like, it can do all of this stuff. Is giving your character, your unit, +1 to hit really worth it? Or are you better off just taking another unit of Raptors? Almost every time I write a list, I end up with at least 1 unit of Raptors, sometimes 2, because I just think that the utility of having multiple fast units being able to run around and engage in the game is almost always better than just buffing up one of your existing units. Alright, next up we have the Warp Talons, the more expensive brothers of the Raptors. Now these guys, they're interesting in the way that they have a lot of attacks and they get reroll wounds. However, they are very, very easy to kill. They aren't very high strength, so they're winning most things, you know, relatively difficult anyway. So the rerolls, you know, I mean, it's good, but I personally don't necessarily rate them as a damage dealer. If your goal is to put a unit in your army and that unit's job is to blow things up, you're better off with something like Possessed or Chosen. And if your goal is to have something that's going to be tough and durable, then you're also better off with something like Possessed or Chosen. So that Warp Talons fill this really weird role where they're kind of trying to do the Raptor's job of being a fast or a harassing unit, whilst doing the Possessed and the Chosen's role of being that hard-hitting damage-dealing unit. And to be honest, I don't think they do either of them particularly well, and for what they do, they're very expensive. Their unique ability is interesting in that your opponent has to take desperate breakout tests when they fall back from them, and if they're battle shocked, they get neg1 to that roll, which does mean that if you charge in, you kill something, you tag a bunch of their vehicles, when those vehicles go to fall back, they're going to have to roll a d6, and on certain rolls, depending on whether they're battle shocked or not, there's a decent chance that you're going to actually just kill those units. So if you can pull off that trick, that makes the Warp Talons very interesting. That being said, your opponent knowing this is either just not going to fall back, and if they're vehicles, they're just going to shoot you in combat, or if they're combat, units, well, you're going to tick over into your opponent's turn, and that's not particularly interesting time to be locked in combat with someone. So I don't know. I personally don't rate the Warp Talons. I've tried them out a little bit, and I've found their damage to be quite underwhelming. Earlier in the edition, what I tried was them with a Rapid Ingress, because I thought a Rapid Ingress with a unit that has fly and a 12-inch move is really interesting, because you can drop them out of line of sight, then you can fly over the screening unit and charge the units that were behind. If you make these guys Mark of Slanesh, they can advance and charge as well. So that's quite interesting. And, you can push quite deep with them. But I just found that their damage dealing capacity was very underwhelming. And they also just died way too easy. So those expensive points that you've spent on this unit generally got flushed down the toilet. So I very rapidly removed them from lists that I was playing with. Alright, Havocs are an interesting unit here. So they're 135 points for 5 models, and they can take 4 Havoc las cannons, which I really like. They're strength 12, they're high AP, and they're d6 plus 1 damage. Now these guys are quite interesting, because I actually think 135 points for that damage profile is relatively cheap, relatively good, and because they're not a vehicle, you can deploy them out of line of sight on one side of the wall, and then when you want to shoot with them, you can move onto the other side of the wall, blast your opponent, and then if you make the Mark of Nurgle, when your opponent goes to shoot you back, you can spend 1 strat to use Dark Obscuration, and they can't shoot your Havocs. And then in your turn, you can shoot them again. And you can basically rinse and repeat this over and over and do serious damage with these guys by utilizing the fact that they can walk through walls because they're infantry, and use Mark of Nurgle's Dark Obscuration to make them untargetable. It actually means that they can bring those las cannons to bear for a large portion of the game. Quite interesting. It's also worth noting that they ignore hit and ballistic skill modifiers, so if your opponent's going to try to do something to make themselves difficult to hit, or if they have some kind of stealth ability, you're going to be like, nah, don't care, never heard of ya, eat las cannons. And that makes them quite interesting. I quite like a unit of Havocs. I think they're a very powerful unit. Alright, now let's talk about Obliterators. Now these guys got a pretty serious glow up in this edition in my opinion, and it all ties to their unique ability which allows them once per game when doing a Dark Pact to fire indirect shooting. And you can now take them in units of 4, whereas it used to be units of 1, 2 or 3, now it's either 2 or 4. And that means that you're getting a lot more utility out of stratagems that you use on these guys. Really, really interesting units. So what I like is one big unit with Mark of Nurgle, and what you do is you put it in Deep Strike, then in your second or third turn, you Deep Strike it out of line of sight, you use its Dark Pact, and you use its ability to fire indirect, and you shoot your opponent. And because you dropped out of line of sight, your opponent can't retaliate. They can't overwatch you, they can't intercept you, and in their turn, they're going to struggle to shoot you. Then you go into your next turn, and because they're infantry, you move through the walls, like we said with the Havocs, and now you're on the other side of the wall, you shoot them again, and then when they go to return fire, because you're Mark of Nurgle, you can pop the Dark Obscuration strat, and now they can't target you again, which means your opponent's going to have to commit serious effort in their plans to deal with these Obliterators, and they put out serious firepower. It's also worth noting that the Obliterators punch pretty hard with strength 9, 2 damage, 4 attacks per model, so that unit of 4 is going to go in and they're going to punch things pretty hard, they shoot things pretty hard, they're tough with toughness 7 and a 2-up save, and they have the ability to use Mark of Nurgle and indirect shooting to make it so your opponent's going to really struggle to shoot you down. These guys are gangster. Alrighty guys, let's talk about the Humble Land Raider. Now, it got to glow up in the way that it's a lot tougher than it was before, as most vehicles received the similar treatment. That being said, there is a lot of anti-vehicle weaponry in the game that people are taking specifically because so many vehicles got tougher. So that toughness, you don't really feel it that much in my experience. I've found that most of the time vehicles are dying just as easily. It's just people are bringing very specifically anti-vehicle tech in their lists. The one interesting thing that this thing did get was the assault ramp, which means that you can disembark units after it moves. So you can take a unit of Terminators with a 5-inch move, and instead of them just moving 5 inches and then declaring a 2d6 charge, they can be in the Land Raider, which moves 10 inches, then they disembark out their 3 for a total of 13 inches worth of movement, and then do their charge. So you're almost tripling the movement characteristic of the Terminator units that you put inside these Land Raiders. The problem with that is that now we're talking about bringing in a Land Raider, which is relatively expensive, a Terminator unit that's relatively expensive, and you now have to move that Land Raider around terrain. And that means that the Terminators are probably going to end up getting slowed down by that. Whereas if you just deploy the Terminators, they can walk through walls, or you can deep strike your Terminators, you can rapid ingress them, those sorts of things. I have seen some people talking about rapid ingressing the Land Raider itself with the Terminators inside, which is kind of interesting as well. So yeah, let me know what you guys think of the Chaos Land Raider, if you've got any particular tricks that you've seen. For me, I think they're interesting, they provide decent firepower, and they are hard to kill. However, I don't know whether or not they provide the transport utility that we hoped they would, simply because they are slowish themselves for vehicles, and they have to navigate the terrain, which can be quite difficult to do with such a large vehicle. Alright, next up we have the Predator Annihilator and Predator Destructor. These guys are around the 130 to 135 point mark, so they're actually quite aggressively costed. They're kind of tough, and they have decent firepower. However, they're competing with things like Havocs, and Havocs have the ability to walk through walls. So what you're essentially having is a conversation about whether or not you want the durability of a tank, or the ability to walk through walls of infantry. Either way, these guys are quite effective and quite aggressively costed in their points. 135 points is not a lot for a unit that's going to be able to contribute to the firefight in a meaningful way. The Annihilator brings a Strength 14 twin-linked las cannon and has an ability that allows it to re-roll damage rolls of 1, which means this guy's bringing a las cannon that's going to do serious, reliable, and effective damage to enemy vehicles. And the Destructor brings a 4-shot, 3-damage autocannon that's going to be AP2 when targeting infantry units, which means that he's going to be popping those tough things like enemy Terminators and that sort of stuff with relative ease. So these guys are both really interesting in my opinion, and I think you could definitely fit a couple of these guys in a competitive Chaos Space Marines list. Alright, next up we have the Vindicator. Now this guy's a bit of a sleeper in my opinion. Vindicators have almost never been competitively viable, and I think this guy's just on the cusp. His toughness 11 with a 2-up save, so he's actually very hard to kill, and he brings an absolute ball breaker of a cannon. So he's got D6 plus 3 shots and it's blast, which means if you're shooting into a unit of 10 models, you're going to get D6 plus 5 shots. And if you make him Mark of Nurgle, he's going to get exploding 5s to hit with his sustained hits. So he's going to be doing a massive number of hits. And then he's very high strength, very high AP, and D6 damage. So I think this guy absolutely blasts things. He also has a siege shield, which basically allows him to fire his blast weapon in melee, even though normally you would not be able to do that. So if your opponent tries to tag him and stop down his shooting, you're going to be like, no, I'm just going to roll the cannon out and blast you in front of me. And yeah, really, really powerful. And I think these guys are really interesting. You can put them in strat reserves so that they come on from a table edge, get angles with that big cannon, blow something up, and you put them in a position where they're relatively removed from your opponent's anti-tank weaponry, which means that they're going to have a really hard time responding to this threat, and you're probably going to get multiple turns of shooting with him. And because he's Mark of Nurgle, as I said, you can use Dark Obscuration to make it so that your opponent struggles to shoot him from long range, making him survive even longer. Alright, next up we have the Defiler. Now this model suffers from a very serious problem, and that is that it's quite large. The base that it comes on is almost 6 inches in around, and that's going to make it very difficult to maneuver him on the battlefield. And one of the most powerful parts of the Defiler is its melee profile, which means you're going to really struggle to get into melee, and therefore you're not going to really be able to bring this model to bear. And in my opinion, until we get different terrain rules or different abilities to interact with terrain, the Defiler kind of just doesn't work as a unit. It does say on its data sheet that it ignores terrain features that are 4 inches or shorter, but a lot of terrain features are going to be 6 inches tall. So unless your tournament has specifically got terrain that is set up in such a way that Defilers are going to be able to move around the tabletop, you're going to really struggle. So if you are considering bringing a Defiler, I highly recommend reaching out to your tournament organizer in advance, asking them for some photos of what sorts of terrain they have or what the table layouts are likely to look like, so that you can then decide whether or not you think a Defiler is going to be viable in a list, because that massive base can be a huge pain in the ass, and it's going to be really difficult to move it around if the terrain is inhospitable to Defilers. He does bring some interesting shooting, but unfortunately, until we get clarification on or some way of working around the terrain features on this guy's big base, he's unplayable in my opinion. Alright, let's talk about one of my standouts, one of my favorite units in the Codex, and that is the Forge Fiend. Now, you give this guy triple ectoplasma cannon, he's getting 3d3 shots, and each one of them is blast, which means if you're shooting at a target that is 10 models big, you're going to get 3d3 plus 6 shots. So he puts out a ridiculous amount of shooting. It's strength 10, so it's going to be getting things like Terminators, wounding them on 2+, or things like vehicles, you're going to be wounding them on 4+, depending on the toughness characteristic of the target. But either way, it's high strength and it's high AP with 3 damage. So this is really, really effective profile into everything from mech to elite infantry and horde. It does it all because of the blast keyword. Those hordes just evaporate because of the blast keyword and the high AP and damage 3. Those elite infantry just evaporate. He's really, really good. But one of the things that makes him absolute next level is that he has the ability to get devastating wounds when he does a Dark Pact. So what you can do is you take one of these guys with unmarked, you bring him on from strategic reserves, you spend 1 command point to give him full rerolls to hit and wound, and now he's going in with all of those shots, and every 6 to wound is doing 3 mortal wounds to the target. This guy single-handedly routinely kills an entire unit of Necron warriors, an entire 20-man unit of literally anything in the game. He kills, 3 or 4 custodian guard, he kills a bunch of Terminators, he kills a small knight, he kills almost anything that he comes on and targets. He's very, very effective. And these guys, 165 points is pretty expensive, but they're very, very strong. I often find that what you want is 3 of these guys in a list, and you probably want 2 of them with Mark of Nurgle and 1 of them with a Mark of Undivided. The 2 with Mark of Nurgle deploy on the table so that they can use the Dark Obscuration to protect themselves from shooting, and they also get exploding 5s or sustained hits on those shooting attacks on 5+. So that's really, really effective. And then one of them comes on from strategic reserves and uses this stratagem to just absolutely blast something to pieces. So there's a few different ways that you can do it. You could do 2 unmarked and 1 Nurgle, or you could do 2 Nurgle and 1 unmarked. Either way, these guys are an absolute staple in every Chaos Space Marine list that I've written, and that's where I start. I go, cool, first thing I write is 3 Forge Fiends. Now what do I want? And you look at other ways that you can build around the Forge Fiends, because they're just so effective, so efficient, and so versatile. They deal with everything. So they're a real good all-comers kind of list. All right, next up we have the Hellbrute. Now he's 150 points and he has a really cool ability that's a 6-inch aura of friendly units gain both the lethal and sustained hits from their Dark Pact. So this can be really, really interesting. It doesn't synergize particularly well with things that have devastating wounds, because with those you don't want lethal hits, because if you roll a lethal hit, it just automatically wounds, which means you don't get to make a wound roll, which means you're not going to be able to roll a 6 to wound and therefore trigger the devastating wounds. So it doesn't necessarily work with things like the Forge Fiends, but if you run this guy up the field and he's near some Terminators and some Possessed and some bits and pieces all over the place, but he's providing that aura, he can be a real force multiplier, whilst simultaneously being a beat stick himself. You give him 2 fists and he's got reroll wounds on his own attacks, or you give him las cannons and missile launchers and he's firing down range. He is a really good candidate to sit with your Predators or your Havocs, and he can provide them, because they don't have the devastating wounds, they just want to reroll all their hits. They want to go in and do massive amounts of damage with sustained hits and lethal hits, and he provides them with both, whilst providing fire support himself. I really like this guy. Alright, next up we have true air superiority in terms of the Helldrake. So his unique ability is that he gets +1 to his hit rolls when targeting fly, and his weapons have anti-fly 2+, which means they wound things that have the fly keyword on a 2+ automatically. So he's really, really effective at dealing with things that have the fly keyword. Unfortunately, you don't see a lot of fly keyword these days because there's a lot of things like the Custodies, the Necrons, the Knights, the Thousand Sons. There's lots of really powerful things like Genestealer Cult. A lot of the top tier factions that are running around at the moment, the Space Marines, a lot of these things don't rely super heavily on the fly keyword. He is really interesting in the Eldar matchup because Eldar do have a lot of things with the fly keyword, the Night Spinners, the Fire Prisms, those sorts of things. But yeah, I'm not 100% sold on him as a unit. He's very expensive as well for what he does. I think if he got a points reduction, he might enter the conversation, but as it stands, I'm not entirely sure that he's worth it. Alright, next up we have the Mauler Fiend. He's the close combat variant of his brother, the Forge Fiend, and I think if you have this kit, you're going to be wanting to make the Forge Fiend. The Mauler Fiend, however, is interesting. He can reroll advance and charge rolls. He ignores modifiers to his movement characteristic, which there's a lot of things in the game right now that do -2 to your movement characteristic, so he ignores all of that, and that makes him a relatively reliable combat monster. And also, this edition doesn't degrade movement, and one of the biggest weaknesses to the Mauler Fiends in the past has been that all you have to do is hurt it a little bit, slow it down, and then you can just run away from it and it'll never make combat. That's not the case with these guys anymore. It's very hard to stop them from eventually making combat. I guess the downside to these guys is that they are a vehicle that does heavy melee damage, and vehicles are quite easy to avoid when you've got walls that you can hide behind, terrain that you can manipulate. You can make it quite difficult for these things to get into melee. And if you can't hide behind walls, you can just hide behind your own units. You can put a string of infantry in front of your vehicles, and now that Mauler Fiend can't charge the vehicles because there's a row of infantry in the way. So vehicles that do combat damage are often suboptimal and easy to sort of manage in terms of mitigating their threats. So a competent player is going to make it very difficult for you to get value out of your Mauler Fiend. All right, next up, we've got the Humble Rhino. We all know and love them. I did a tactics video deep diving rhinos called the Rhino Masterclass back in 9th edition, and every single trick that I talked about in that masterclass still applies today. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how you can get utility out of your rhinos, check that video out. But realistically, what you've got here is a cheap, tough unit that's going to make the units inside it even tougher. It's going to increase their movement capacity, and it unlocks a whole bunch of different tricks and shenanigans you can do to prevent your opponent from doing massive amounts of damage to you. So I really do like the Rhino, and I'll often consider putting a Rhino with a unit of Legionaries and a character inside of it as a little nugget that can run out and do serious damage. Alright, next up we have the Chaos Spawn. Now these guys are limited to a unit of 2. You can't take 1, you can't take 6. You must just take units of 2, and I think that really does kill the identity of this unit. Chaos Spawn used to be these things that you would often just take 1 of because it was a 25-point model, and it would help you fill out your army if you had a few points left to spend, and it was a unit that could sit there on an objective somewhere and be relatively inconsequential, so your opponent often wouldn't want to commit resources to killing it because it's just one little 25-point model. So it provided, screens, it did a lot of stuff for that value. Whereas now that you're forced to buy 2 of them, now you're getting into a point where the unit's actually kind of expensive. It's not as disposable as it was before, and as a result, you're better off probably looking into other things. For example, a unit of 2 Chaos Spawn is 80 points, so that's almost the same as Noise Marines, that's almost the same as Raptors, that's more than a unit of Cultists, and I think the role that these Spawn fill is better filled by Cultists. So I couldn't imagine a world where I would take these 2 Chaos Spawn over a unit of Cultists with points left over to upgrade other things. So unfortunately, all of those Chaos Spawn models I think are going to sit on the shelf and collect dust, probably until the Codex, if we get something in the Codex that makes them interesting. Alright, next up we have the Khorne Lord of Skulls. Now this guy has just gone up in points from 420 to 480 points, which is a pretty significant points hike. However, He's very good for his points. He's still cheaper than a lot of the knights that are running around, and he does very similar stuff. He's a little bit slower, but he puts out way more melee damage and considerable shooting damage as well. So I'm a huge fan of the Khorne Lord of Skulls. He also has an ability that basically means that if he kills something in melee, in your opponent's next command phase, everybody within 6 inches of him has to take a battle shock test, and if they fail it, obviously that's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt their ability to score primary, it's going to hurt their ability to use stratagems on their units, it's going to hurt their ability to do all kinds of things, particularly if they want to fall back from combat with this big scary melee monster. So there's a lot of stuff about the Lord of Skulls that's really, really interesting and really worth digging into, and even though they did just receive that points hike, I think they're still very valuable. The towering keyword on them is really, really powerful because it allows you to just see most of the battlefield. It's very hard for your opponent to hide from you. So you're firing that skull hurler downrange, you're blasting things, you're pressing up into the center objective, and nobody wants to go near that central objective when there's a Lord of Skulls pressing on it. This guy also, because he's in the Chaos Space Marine army and he has Mark of Khorne, he can fight on death on a 3+. So if you push him up into the center, you shoot some stuff, your opponent charges him and kills him, he's very likely to fight back when he does die, and he's going to kill whatever killed him. Which means if he's on an objective and your opponent tries to kill you off with melee threat, you're probably going to kill them as well, and then neither of you hold the objective, which is way better than having your opponent kill you off and then claim it for themselves. Alright, next up we have the Noctilith Crown. Now, a lot of tournaments these days don't actually allow fortifications just because they're one of those things that's relatively hard to balance, relatively hard to factor in when working out deployment zones and terrain layouts and those sorts of things. So a lot of tournaments don't allow fortifications. But for those that do, this is kind of interesting. It has a 9-inch aura of a 4-up invulnerable save, which is going to make all of your units significantly tougher. And it means that if you take Abaddon in the list, Abaddon can focus on his aura of reroll hits, whilst the Crown provides the aura of invulnerable saves. So you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too in a lot of ways with the Crown. And it's also relatively hard to shift. It's, toughness, and it's got wounds, and it's a tough unit that your opponent's probably not likely going to want to be dedicating shooting into because they're going to be busy trying to kill your active units that are out there pushing onto objectives that are out there doing damage to them. So they're going to be wanting to focus on all of that sort of stuff, which means the Crown is likely to survive several turns. It's also worth noting that the Noctilith Crown's aura of 4-up invulnerable save isn't limited to infantry units. So you can take this thing and you can put 3 Predators nearby and your Forge Fiends nearby and just have this castle, and all of those are going to have 4-up invulnerable saves, which makes them significantly tougher, particularly on things like Predators that don't have the invulnerable save already built into them. Alright, now let's talk about Vashdor, the new kid on the block. He's got a really interesting ability that's a 6-inch aura of +1 to the strength characteristic of friendly units, which means that those Forge Fiends that we're talking about that are really, really powerful and really, really competitive go up to strength 11 with their shooting attacks, which means that all of these toughness 10 things in the game, they're now wounding on 3+, which is a really significant buff. Vashdor also can pick an enemy unit within range, and he can make them halve their movement and also reduce their attacks characteristic in melee by 1, which means that if there is something big and scary coming up towards you, you can really slow it down with Vashdor. Alright, next up we have the Traitor Guardsmen. These guys fill a very similar role to the Cultists. However, instead of being able to sticky objectives, they gain the benefit of cover whilst on objectives, which is kind of interesting, but to be honest, they're kind of weak anyway, and if people are targeting you, they're probably just going to blow you up anyway. And if they were targeting you with something that could blow you up, you're probably going to want to be using that strat of Dark Obscuration on them to stop them from getting blown up, in which case gaining the benefits of cover isn't that really interesting, right? So I think Cultists outperform these guys in almost every way, primarily because they have the sticky objectives. They can stick the objective and then they can fuck off, and your opponent can't deal with them, and that's way better than getting the benefit of cover. Alright, next we have the Felgor Beastmen. Now these guys fill, again, a similar role to the Cultists and the Traitor Guardsmen in that they're their cheap, sort of disposable, squishy units. What these guys provide that's different though is the Scout 6-inch move, which means that you're able to push up onto those central objectives earlier in the game if your opponent's coming at you with scout or infiltrate units, you can screen them out, you can push them back, and you can also get yourself in positions where you're going to be able to cap those objectives on the flanks early in the game. Because you can scout move, and then in your first turn you can move, and now you're on that objective. So this is quite interesting. It pairs quite interestingly with Huron, because being able to redeploy those units and scout those units means that you can basically wait until your opponent's done all of their decision making, and then you can go, cool, now I'm just going to redeploy those units in a completely different fashion. So this is quite interesting. I like the Felgor Beastmen. They are a bit too expensive for my liking though, and the fact that they don't have the sticky objectives that the Cultists do means that they kind of don't fill that same role as something that's a cheap objective grabber. They're not doing the damage and they're not controlling the objectives, so to me, they're not really a viable pick. Alright, next up we have the Traitor Enforcer. Now this guy is designed to be a unit that you attach to Traitor Guardsmen. However, I actually think he performs better on his own because he's a 2-model unit, and one of the models in there is an Ogryn, which is toughness 6, and this unit's only 65 points. So think of like what a spawn unit does. This unit does the same thing but way better. It's cheaper than a spawn unit. It's actually one of the cheapest units available in the Codex, and it's going to be toughness 6, which means if you have that out of line of sight somewhere on an objective, most barrage is going to kind of struggle to pop that, and if they are popping that, they're putting significant damage into something that's toughness 6 and has a feel no pain save as well. So can take quite a bit of shooting to actually put it down, and that's shooting that your opponent's probably going to want to be spending elsewhere killing your damage dealers. It's shooting that would evaporate 10 cultists, probably won't evaporate this unit. So it's a little bit tougher, and it provides a little bit more utility in that, and it also does okay damage for a 65-point unit. But once again, if it's going to be fulfilling that role, I think you're probably better off with Cultists, and because Cultists are better than the Traitor Guardsmen, I don't think you're going to want to be taking Traitor Guardsmen and this guy and adding this guy to the Traitor Guardsmen. I think you're probably better off just going with the Cultists. Just stick with what we know and what we love. And there we have it, guys. That was an absolute marathon, and we finally got through every single data sheet in the Chaos Space Marines Index. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. If you found any of this interesting, if you learned anything, let's talk about it in the comments section below. And thanks for tuning in, guys. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, head over to blogforthebloodgod.com. You can join our Discord. You can join our Patreon. You can pick up apparel like this. You can pick up battle mats like the ones behind me. You can pick up really cool dice, neoprene objective markers. There's so much cool stuff on that website that you can pick up that's going to make it a great way for you to show your support for the channel and help me out, help me improve the quality of this content and the frequency in which I can get it out, as well as getting yourself some sweet swag on the way. So yeah, thanks again, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Blog for the Blood God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment, he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.